The whole town of Coldwater, Kansas, in the summer of 1883, knew how to turn truth into lies before you could catch your breath. But the man who started the ugliest rumor that summer wasn't a romantic stranger. He was the one who'd been raised by the very hands of his victim. Dust hung thick in the air that June afternoon as the locomotive hissed to a stop at the Coldwater depot. From the third passenger car emerged a woman who would change everything. Ruby Mae Watson was 24 years old, her dress too tight across the shoulders, her hands wrapped around a single battered leather suitcase that held her entire future. She was a mail-order bride, sent west by ink and paper in desperation, promised to a man she had never touched, never seen, never heard speak her name aloud. The step down from the train car was narrow, built for slender women. Ruby's foot caught the edge and she stumbled, arms windmilling for balance. The suitcase tumbled from her grip, bursting open, spilling her belongings across the platform. A few carefully altered dresses, a book about cattle ranching, a photograph of her mother in a tarnished silver frame. From somewhere near the saloon came cruel laughter. A man's voice, thick with beer, drifted across the platform. "Lord have mercy, she's bigger than Mercer's prize bull." Ruby's face burned as she dropped to her knees, gathering her things with trembling fingers. Then she saw the boots, worn leather, dusty from hard work, stopping just beside her scattered belongings. Large, calloused hands began picking up her dresses, folding each one carefully, placing them back into the broken suitcase as if they were made of silk. Ruby looked up slowly. Silas Tobias Crow stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, shoulders broad as an oak beam, weathered by 52 years of mountain and prairie living. His hair was dark brown, shot through with silver, long enough to tie back at his neck. His beard was thick and untrimmed, reaching almost to his chest, streaked with gray, the way men wore it in the Appalachian Mountains where he'd been born. He didn't smile, but he didn't stare at her body with judgment either. He simply looked into her eyes with a steady, quiet gaze that made something in her chest loosen. When he spoke, his voice was deep and slow, carrying the distinct rhythm of Appalachia. "Miss Watson, I'm Silas Crow. You've come a long way to get here. Let me handle the rest." He finished gathering her belongings, then offered his hand to help her stand. His palm was rough with calluses, but his grip was gentle. Ruby took his hand and rose to her feet. For the first time in months since she'd left Pittsburgh in shame, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Safety. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas nodded once. "Wagon's just over there." From across the platform, leaning against a post near the saloon, another man watched them. Nash Coleman Tucker was 35, dressed like a businessman in a dark blue vest and polished shoes, his hair slicked back with pomade. Where Silas was rough and weathered, Nash was smooth and cultivated. Where Silas stood silent and solid, Nash moved with easy confidence. Nash pushed away from the post and walked toward them, boots clicking on the wooden boards. His smile was practiced and perfect. Well, welcome to Coldwater, sister-in-law," Nash said, the words dripping with false warmth. "I'm Nash Tucker, Silas's younger brother. Welcome to our little corner of paradise." His eyes moved over Ruby from head to toe, not quite disguising the calculation behind the friendly expression. Ruby felt it immediately, that sense of being measured, weighed, assessed. "Thank you, Mr. Tucker," Ruby said quietly. Nash's smile widened. "Please call me Nash. We're family now." He glanced at Silas. "I see my brother's already shown you his legendary charm. All business, no conversation." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Are you sure you came for the right brother? Easy to mix up the names in these mail arrangements." He said it like a joke, but his eyes said something darker. Something possessive. Before Ruby could respond, Silas moved, stepping between her and Nash. His broad shoulders blocked Nash from view. "We're leaving," Silas said quietly. Nash's smile never faltered. "Of course, Ruby, if you need anything at all, you just let me know. Silas is a good man, but he doesn't always understand how to treat a lady from the city." The way he said lady made Ruby's skin crawl. Silas guided Ruby toward the wagon, one hand hovering near her elbow, but not quite touching. Behind them, Nash stood watching, his smile fading into something colder the moment they turned away. As Ruby climbed into the wagon, she caught a flash of memory. Her uncle's study in Pittsburgh, 3 months ago, his voice cold and final. "Ruby, you have no other options. A man from out west, 30 years older than you, who's never even met you. That's the only chance you've got. Your father's gambling debts destroyed this family, and your situation makes you unmarriageable here. Don't ruin this too." She remembered being 15 at her cousin's Christmas party, hearing the whisper just loud enough. She ate the entire dessert tray by herself, like an animal. It hadn't even been true, but truth didn't matter when the story was better. She looked at Silas as he climbed up beside her, taking the reins. This man who hadn't laughed at her, hadn't judged her. Maybe this strange arrangement could become something real. The wagon rolled out onto the open prairie. Kansas stretched out endlessly, grass rippling under the summer wind. Far to the north, hills rose like dark shadows. Silas didn't force conversation. After several minutes of comfortable silence, he raised one hand and pointed toward the distant hills. "Those are the Smoky Hills. Come winter, they're covered in snow. Come spring, there's wildflowers everywhere you look." Ruby found her voice. "Did you grow up in those hills?" "No, ma'am. Grew up in the Appalachian Mountains back in Kentucky. Came out here when I was 18 with nothing but a rifle and $50 I'd saved." "Why did you leave?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "My parents died when I was 16. Fever took them both within a week. Left me and Nash orphaned. He was only 10 years old. I raised him best I could, brought him west, sent him to school when we had money. Thought he'd turn out better than me." "Nash seems very different from you," Ruby said carefully. "He's smart. Always was. But he wanted to be a gentleman, wanted to prove he was better than his mountain roots. Sent himself back east for a few years to learn business and manners. Came back different, polished. But something got lost in the polishing." Ruby heard the sorrow underneath the words. This was a man who'd sacrificed everything for his brother, only to watch that brother grow into someone he barely recognized. They rode in silence for a while. Then Ruby asked quietly, "Can I ask why you looked for a wife through letters? Surely there are women here who would want a good man like you." Silas kept his eyes on the road. "Women here want men who are young and rich and smooth talking. I'm none of those things. I'm old, rough around the edges, don't have much to say. I'm not what they're looking for." "And I'm not what anyone's looking for either," Ruby said quietly. Silas turned to look at her fully. His dark eyes were serious and absolutely honest. "Anyone who can't see your worth is blind, not you unworthy. That's their failing, not yours." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Ruby felt something crack open in her chest. This wasn't just safety anymore. This was the beginning of something else. They arrived at the ranch as twilight painted the sky golden orange. The house was simple but solid, 2 stories of good timber, with a wide porch and windows glowing with lamplight. Behind it stood a barn, a chicken coop, fenced pastures where cattle grazed. It wasn't grand, but it was clean and well-maintained, and it felt more like home than anywhere Ruby had lived in years. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief and respectful, then carried her broken suitcase to the door. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and leather and coffee. The furniture was simple but well-made, everything clean and organized. He led her upstairs and opened a door to reveal a small bedroom with a window overlooking the pasture. A bed with clean quilts, a washstand, a chair by the window. "This is your room," Silas said quietly. "There's a lock on the inside of the door. I sleep downstairs." Ruby turned to look at him, surprised. "You don't expect me to share your bed?" Silas met her eyes steadily. "A marriage certificate on paper doesn't mean you lose the right to decide for yourself. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, you'll tell me. If that day never comes, I'll still keep my promise to take care of you." Something in Ruby's chest cracked open wider. This rough, bearded mountain man was treating her with more dignity than anyone in her educated, civilized family had ever shown her. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Silas nodded and turned to leave. He paused at the door. "I'll have supper ready in about 20 minutes. Nothing fancy, just bacon and beans and bread. You come down when you're ready." After he left, Ruby sat on the bed and let herself cry. Quiet tears of relief and exhaustion and fragile hope. 20 minutes later, she descended to find Silas at the stove, dishing food onto 2 plain plates. She sat at the table and he placed a plate in front of her. He bowed his head briefly in silent prayer, then began to eat. Ruby picked up her fork, acutely aware of every bite, the old anxiety creeping back. After a few minutes, she spoke carefully. "Is this enough food?" I mean, there's more if I'm still hungry. Silas looked up, genuinely confused. You want more? I can cook more. Should have asked what you usually eat. Ruby realized he didn't understand. He thought she was simply asking because she was hungry, not apologizing for her existence. In Pittsburgh, she said carefully, people used to say I ate enough for 3 people. Silas chewed thoughtfully, then spoke in that measured way he approached everything. Out here, people notice who works hard and who keeps their word. The rest, how much you eat or what you look like, that's none of their business. It was such a simple statement, but it settled something in Ruby's heart that she'd been carrying for years. After supper, Silas pulled out an old banjo from beside the fireplace. The instrument was worn, but clearly treasured. He plucked a few notes, adjusting the strings, then began to play. The melody was slow and mournful, speaking of mountains and loneliness and memories that never quite faded. You play beautifully, Ruby said softly. My mother taught me, back in the Appalachian Mountains when I was a boy. He was only 10, so small and scared. I didn't know how to comfort him except to play the songs Mama used to play. His fingers picked out another verse, notes floating through the quiet house. I raised him as best I could, worked whatever jobs I could find, saved every penny, finally got enough to buy this land, sent Nash to school whenever we had money, wanted him to have opportunities I never had. He paused. But sometimes I wonder if I did it wrong. He looks at me now like I embarrass him, like I'm a reminder of everything he wants to forget. That's not your fault, Ruby said quietly. Maybe not, but it's still painful. He set the banjo aside. I'm not good with words, Miss Ruby, but I want you to know something important. You're safe here. Whatever brought you all the way west to marry a stranger, it doesn't follow you through that door. This is your home now. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were different, something that felt dangerously close to hope. That night, she lay in her small room listening to the prairie wind and the distant call of night birds. For the first time in years, she slept without nightmares. But 15 miles away in Coldwater, Nash Coleman Tucker sat at a scarred desk with pen and paper and whiskey at his elbow. He was writing a letter he'd never send, addressed to a woman named Lydia Ashford Montgomery, who lived in Philadelphia now, married to a banker. Nash's hand trembled as he wrote, Dear Mrs. Montgomery, I wanted you to know that I've prospered here in Kansas. I have respect in this community, and soon I'll have a wife from the city, a real lady. Perhaps you'll realize what you rejected. He stared at the words, then crumpled the paper and threw it in the corner. The truth was simpler and more painful. Lydia Ashford had never loved him, had never even considered him. When he'd asked for her hand 6 years ago, she'd laugh and, Mr. Tucker, you're nothing but a hired hand for your brother. I don't marry dependents. That moment had broken something in Nash. He'd spent 6 years trying to prove her wrong, and now his brother, his crude, uneducated mountain man brother, had found himself a city bride, a woman from Pittsburgh, from the same world that had rejected Nash. It was unbearable. Nash pulled out fresh paper and began to write a plan. Names and dates and strategies, his mind working through the problem like a chess game. Ruby Watson was the key. If he could turn the town against Silas, if he could show everyone that the rough mountain man didn't know how to treat a refined lady properly, if he could position himself as the civilized alternative, then everything would shift. It wasn't about loving her. Nash didn't love anyone except himself, but she represented everything he needed to prove he'd risen above his origins. There was a knock at his door. Joel Levi Henricks entered, hat in hand, eager as a hunting dog. Joel was 28, lean and hungry, the kind of man who'd do anything for the right price. You wanted to see me, Mr. Tucker? Nash poured 2 glasses of whiskey. I have a job for you, pays $50. Joel's eyes went wide. $50 was more than he made in 2 months. Nash leaned back, choosing his words carefully. My brother has married a woman from the city. I'm concerned that Silas doesn't know how to treat her properly. His manners are crude. I need documentation of any impropriety. Nothing manufactured. Just observe. And if you witness something inappropriate, you come straight to me. You want me to spy on your brother? I want you to protect a vulnerable woman, Nash corrected. If Silas is treating her properly, wonderful, but if not, someone needs to bear witness. Nash counted out 50 silver dollars, stacking them on the table. Joel scooped up the coins, grinning. For this kind of money, Mr. Tucker, I'm very willing. After Joel left, Nash sat alone, drinking whiskey and staring at the wall. He was already composing what he'd say to the townspeople, how he'd express concern without seeming vindictive, how he'd position himself as the worried brother. It would work, because Nash Coleman Tucker refused to spend the rest of his life in Silas's shadow. The first week passed quietly at the ranch. Ruby learned the rhythms of the work, how to gather eggs from the chickens, how to pump water from the well, how to mend fences. Her body ached from unfamiliar labor. Her hands blistered, but there was something deeply satisfying in it. On the third day, she noticed one of the chickens limping badly, its left leg at an odd angle. The hen had been pushed away from food by the others, huddling miserably in the corner. "What about that one?" Ruby asked Silas. Silas glanced over and shook his head. "Legs broken. She won't survive. Best to use her for soup." "Could we fix it? Set the bone?" "I read about making splints in one of my books." Silas studied her, then nodded. "If you want to try, go ahead." Ruby spent the next hour fashioning a tiny splint from thin strips of wood and clean cloth, binding the broken leg as gently as she could while the chickens squawked indignantly. She placed the hen in a separate, small coop with food and water within reach. 3 days later, the chicken was standing on both legs. A week after that, she was walking almost normally. Silas came out one morning and stood watching the hen scratch at the ground, then turned to Ruby with something that might have been a smile beneath his beard. "You've got a talent and patience. Those are worth more than most people realize." That afternoon, Silas asked if she wanted to learn to ride properly. Ruby's immediate response was fear. "I'm too heavy. I'll hurt the horse." Silas led her to the corral where a sturdy older mare stood waiting. "This is Juniper. She's 16 years old, strong as an ox. She's pulled wagons loaded with half a ton of supplies. You're not going to hurt her." Ruby approached slowly. Juniper didn't shy away, just stood steady and calm. Silas showed her how to mount, how to settle into the saddle, how to hold the reins. "Don't rush. The horse can feel fear. Just breathe." Ruby breathed. Juniper began to move. A slow, gentle walk around the corral, Silas walking alongside. For the first time in her life, Ruby felt something like freedom, movement, power. The wind in her face and the simple joy of doing something she'd never thought possible. When she'd completed a full circle, Silas's rare smile appeared. "You did good. Real good." Those 3 words meant more than any elaborate compliment ever had. That evening by the fire, Ruby asked, "Why did you really look for a wife through letters? There must be more to it." Silas poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. "I figured I'd live alone, and that was all right. But I turned 50 last year. Started thinking about what happens to this place when I'm gone. Nash will inherit it, but he doesn't love it. He sees it as money, as status, not as home. I thought maybe if I had a wife, a partner, someone who understood what it means to build something that lasts, maybe it wouldn't all disappear." He turned to look at her. "I didn't advertise expecting love, just honesty, partnership, someone willing to work beside me." "And that's all you want?" Ruby asked softly. "I suppose I hope for more, but I won't demand it. Whatever grows between us, if anything grows, it'll be because we both choose it." The words hung in the air, honest and raw and intimate. Ruby felt something shift inside her. "I chose to come here because I had nowhere else to go," she admitted. "But I'm starting to think I might have chosen right for better reasons than I knew." They sat together in silence as the fire burned down to embers, both beginning to understand that this arrangement might become something real. But out in Coldwater, Joel Henricks was watching and waiting, $50 silver heavy in his pocket, ready to earn his pay the moment opportunity presented itself. And Nash Tucker was planning, always planning, building his trap one careful lie at a time. The 8th day dawned beautiful, sunny and warm with a breeze that kept the heat bearable. Ruby had gained confidence on Juniper and asked Silas if she could practice near the windmill, where the ground was flat and safe. Silas walked alongside her, offering quiet encouragement. Ruby was laughing, actually laughing, feeling more alive than she had in years. Then came the gunshot. A single crack, sharp and sudden, fired from somewhere behind the fence line. Juniper's ears went flat, her eyes rolled white, and she reared up with a terrified whinny. Ruby lost her grip on the reins. The world tilted, sky and earth switching places, and then she hit the ground hard. Pain exploded through her knee and up her leg. She cried out, clutching at the injury as Juniper bolted away. Silas was beside her instantly, dropping to his knees. "Where does it hurt?" "My knee." Ruby gasped through tears. Blood was soaking through her dress. The fabric was torn at the hem from the fall, and Silas's eyes went to the injury, assessing quickly. "I need to see it. Make sure nothing's broken." Ruby's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. "Don't! Someone might see." Silas met her eyes, his expression serious and kind. "Out here, I don't gamble with leg injuries. If it's broken and we don't set it right, you could lose the ability to walk." Ruby's breath came in short gasps. Finally, she nodded. Silas carefully tore the hem of her dress, just enough to expose her knee. His hands were shaking, not with desire, but with worry. He examined the swelling, the scrape, the bruise already blooming purple. "Not broken," he said with relief, "but badly bruised. We need to wrap this." He pulled the kerchief from around his neck and used it to bind her knee gently, his touch so careful Ruby barely felt pain. "I'm going to carry you back to the house. Is that all right?" Ruby nodded, and Silas lifted her as if she weighed nothing. His arms were strong, his chest solid, and Ruby found herself leaning into him, too hurt and exhausted to maintain her usual walls. Neither of them saw Joel Henricks watching from behind the fence line, a smile spreading across his face. Neither of them heard him mount his horse and ride hard toward Coldwater, already composing the story in his head. By the time the sun set that evening, the rumor was already spreading through town like wildfire. At the saloon, Joel sat surrounded by 5 men, his voice carrying across the room. "I'm telling you what I saw with my own eyes. Silas Crow tore his wife's dress right there in the open field. She said don't, clear as day, but he kept right on going. Pulled that fabric up past her knee like she was livestock, not a lady." One man shifted uncomfortably. "Silas isn't that kind of man." Joel leaned forward. "I know what I saw. And that woman, big as she is, she came out here desperate. Probably doesn't know she has rights. Someone needs to look out for her." From the doorway, Nash Tucker entered, his expression carefully arranged into concern. "I heard about Ruby's accident. Is she all right?" Joel nodded slowly. "The fall was bad enough, but what your brother did after, Mr. Tucker, that's what worries me." Nash sat down, signaling for a drink. "My brother raised me. I love him. But he's always been rough, never understood civilized ways. I've been worried about this since I heard he'd sent for a city bride. The seed was planted. By morning it would have roots. By the end of the week it would be a tree no one could cut down." Mrs. Pritchard, owner of the general store, heard the story from her husband that night. She shook her head with pursed lips. "Mountain men. They don't understand how to treat proper women. That poor girl coming all this way just to be subjected to such treatment." At the church, Reverend Samuel Pike heard the whispers after Sunday service. He said nothing, but his silence was its own kind of judgment. Back at the ranch, unaware of the poison spreading through Coldwater, Ruby lay in her bed with her knee wrapped and elevated. Silas had brought her supper on a tray, had checked the bandage with gentle hands, had asked 3 times if she needed anything for the pain. "Silas," she said as he turned to leave, "did I do something wrong? Asking you not to look, I mean." He turned back, his weathered face serious. "No, ma'am, you were in pain and scared. That's natural, but I need you to understand something important. I will never, not ever, let anyone I care about suffer because I'm worried what strangers think. Your health matters more than their opinions. What if they talk? Let them talk. The truth is between you and me. That's all that matters." But as Silas lay in his bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a small voice of worry whispered in the back of his mind. He'd seen the way people looked at him in town sometimes. The rough mountain man, the outsider. He'd never cared before, content to live on his land and ignore their judgments. But now he had Ruby to protect. And if the town turned against him, they'd turn against her too. He didn't know yet that the turning had already begun. In his room above the saloon, Nash Tucker blew out his lamp with a satisfied smile. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Joel had played his part perfectly. The story was spreading. And tomorrow Nash would make his next move. He would visit the ranch. He would express brotherly concern. He would offer Ruby a way out, subtle and kind and impossible to refuse. And when she was isolated enough, desperate enough, grateful enough, she would turn to him instead of Silas. It was only a matter of time. Outside, the Kansas wind blew across the prairie, carrying whispers and lies and the seeds of destruction. The summer night was beautiful, stars brilliant in the endless sky, completely indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath them. Ruby slept fitfully, her knee throbbing, unaware that tomorrow everything would change, that the kindness Silas had shown her would be twisted into something ugly, that the safety she'd finally found would be threatened by a man who saw her not as a person, but as a trophy, a weapon, a way to prove his worth. The trap was set, the bait was laid, and Coldwater, with its hunger for gossip and its fear of difference, was ready to spring it closed. But Ruby Mae Watson was stronger than anyone knew, and Silas Tobias Crow had not survived 52 years of hardship by giving up when things got difficult. The battle was coming. Neither of them knew it yet, but when it arrived, they would face it together, and that would make all the difference. Morning came soft and golden over the Crow Ranch, sunlight filtering through Ruby's window like honey. But the peace didn't last. Her knee throbbed with each heartbeat, the bruise having deepened overnight to purple and black, swollen tight against the bandage Silas had wrapped with such care. She heard him downstairs already, the familiar sounds of the stove being stoked, coffee boiling, the creak of floorboards under his weight. Ruby pulled herself up carefully, testing the leg. She could put weight on it, but barely. Walking would be slow and painful. By the time she made it downstairs, gripping the railing with white knuckles, Silas had breakfast waiting. He looked up from the stove, concern flashing across his weathered face. "You should have called. I would have brought it up." "I can manage," Ruby said, more sharply than she intended, then softer. "I'm sorry, the pain makes me cross." Silas pulled out her chair. "Nothing to apologize for. Sit. Eat. Then I'll check that bandage." They ate in companionable silence, but Ruby noticed something different in Silas's expression. A tightness around his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "What's wrong?" she asked. Silas set down his fork slowly. "Probably nothing, but I'm going into town this morning. Need to speak with Sheriff Holt about something." "About what?" He hesitated, then met her eyes directly. "About making sure if anyone asks questions about your injury, there's a proper record. Doc Brennan should examine you, write up what happened, just to be safe." Ruby felt cold spread through her chest. "You think someone will ask questions?" "I think it's better to be careful." His voice was measured, calm, but Ruby heard the concern underneath. "People talk in small towns. I'd rather have the truth documented before rumors start." But he was too late. The rumors had already begun. In Coldwater, Mrs. Harriet Pritchard opened her general store at precisely 8 o'clock as she had every morning for 23 years. She was 62, rail-thin, with steel-gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face. Her store was her kingdom, and gossip was the currency she valued most. The first customer was barely through the door when Mrs. Pritchard leaned across the counter, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Have you heard about the Crow situation?" Mrs. Eleanor Jensen, a farmer's wife with 4 children and precious little time for nonsense, shook her head. "What situation?" "That mail-order bride he brought in. From Pittsburgh, fancy city girl." "Well," Mrs. Pritchard paused for effect. "Joel Henricks witnessed something disturbing out at their ranch yesterday. Saw Silas Crow manhandle that poor woman right out in the open. Tore her dress clean off," Joel said. "She was crying and saying don't, but Silas just kept right on." Mrs. Jensen's eyes widened. "That doesn't sound like Silas." "Mountain men," Mrs. Pritchard said with a knowing nod. "They don't understand civilized behavior. That poor girl probably came out here desperate, didn't know what she was getting into, and now she's trapped with a man who doesn't know the first thing about treating a lady properly." The story spread like prairie fire in drought season. By mid-morning, half of Coldwater had heard some version of it. Each telling added new details, embellishments that made the story more dramatic, more scandalous, more delicious to repeat. At the church, Reverend Samuel Pike heard it from 3 different sources before noon. He was 55, balding, with soft hands that had never done a day of hard labor. He prided himself on being a moral voice in the community, but he had a particular weakness for avoiding conflict. When Martha Lynn Chen came to see him that afternoon, he already knew what she wanted to discuss. Martha was 42, Chinese-American, owner of the only laundry service in Coldwater. She'd lived in this town for 15 years, had buried her husband here, had faced down prejudice and cruelty with quiet dignity. She knew exactly what rumors could do to a person's life. "Reverend," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I need to talk to you about Ruby Crow." Pike shifted uncomfortably. "I've heard the talk, Mrs. Chen. Very disturbing situation. Have you heard the truth, or just Joel Henrichs' version of events?" The Reverend blinked. "Are you suggesting Joel is lying?" "I'm suggesting that Nash Tucker paid Joel $50 the day before this supposed incident. I'm suggesting that Ruby fell from a horse and Silas checked her injury like any reasonable person would. And I'm suggesting this town is very quick to believe the worst about people who don't fit their expectations." Martha's voice was calm but hard as iron. She'd learned long ago that showing anger only gave people an excuse to dismiss her. Pike spread his hands helplessly. "Even if what you're saying is true, Mrs. Chen, I can't control what people believe. And frankly, your own history with Nash Tucker makes your defense of the Crows seem rather partisan." Martha felt the words like a slap. Her own history. 6 years ago, when Nash had courted her, made promises, then stolen her late husband's land and spread lies about her character when she refused to marry him. The town had believed Nash then too, the respectable businessman over the Chinese widow. She'd fought back, quietly and persistently, until she'd reclaimed her laundry business and her reputation, but it had taken years. "You're right, Reverend," Martha said, standing. "I do have history with Nash Tucker. I know exactly what he's capable of, and I won't stand by while he destroys another woman the way he tried to destroy me." She left before he could respond. Martha walked directly to the Crow Ranch, a journey of nearly 3 miles on foot. By the time she arrived, the afternoon sun was high and hot, and her practical gray dress was damp with sweat. Ruby answered her knock, leaning heavily on the doorframe, her face drawn with pain. "Mrs. Crow," Martha said, "my name is Martha Chen. We need to talk." Inside, over tea that Silas brewed strong and dark, Martha told her story. She spoke calmly, without dramatics, laying out the facts the way she'd learned to do when facts were all you had. 6 years ago, Nash Tucker had courted her. Her husband, William, had been dead less than a year. Nash presented himself as helpful, concerned, a friend in her time of need. He'd offered to help her manage William's small plot of land, handle the legal paperwork, ensure she didn't lose everything. "I signed papers," Martha said quietly. "He told me they were loans, temporary measures until I could get back on my feet. But they were transfer documents. Within 6 months, he owned William's land. When I refused to marry him as payment for his help, he spread rumors, said I'd been unfaithful to William, said I was unstable, said I couldn't be trusted." Ruby listened, her teacup forgotten in her hands, watching this composed woman describe her own destruction with such matter-of-fact calm. "The town believed him," Martha continued. "Why wouldn't they? He's charming, well-spoken, respectable. I'm a Chinese widow. For 2 years, I had no customers at my laundry. I nearly starved. It was only when Silas started bringing me his washing, publicly and consistently, that others slowly began to follow. He never asked why I needed help. He just helped." Silas, sitting in his chair by the cold fireplace, said nothing, but his weathered face showed discomfort at being praised. "Why are you telling me this?" Ruby asked. "Because Nash is doing the same thing to you that he did to me. He's creating a narrative where you're the victim and Silas is the villain and Nash is the hero who can save you. And this town will believe it because it's a better story than the truth." "What is the truth?" Martha leaned forward. "The truth is Nash Coleman Tucker cannot stand being second to his brother in anything. He sees you as a trophy, proof that he can win something Silas has. He doesn't love you. He doesn't even know you. You're just a symbol of everything he thinks he deserves." Ruby felt sick. She'd known Nash made her uncomfortable, but this calculated cruelty was beyond anything she'd imagined. "What do we do?" she asked. "We fight back," Martha said simply. "But we have to be smart about it. We need proof of what Nash is doing. We need allies. And we need you to be strong enough to stand up in front of this town and tell your truth, even when they don't want to hear it." Over the next hour, they made a plan. Silas would go to Sheriff Abner Holt, explain the situation, provide context. Martha would quietly reach out to the few people in town she trusted, plant seeds of doubt about Joel's story. Ruby would see Doc Brennan, get a medical examination that would document the injury was consistent with a fall, nothing more. But even as they planned, They all knew the hardest part was yet to come. Nash Tucker arrived at the ranch the next afternoon, riding a glossy black horse that probably cost more than most people in Coldwater earned in a year. He dismounted with practiced grace, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Ruby watched from the window as he approached. Silas was out checking the cattle, wouldn't be back for another hour. She considered not answering the door, but something told her this confrontation was inevitable. Better to face it now, on her terms. She opened the door before he could knock. Nash's smile was warm and concerned, his eyes immediately going to her bandaged knee visible beneath her hem. "Ruby, I heard about your accident. I brought some things from town, fresh bread, use other supplies. How are you feeling?" "I'm fine, thank you." Ruby didn't step aside to let him in. Nash's smile flickered slightly. "May I come in? Just for a moment. I've been so worried." Against her better judgment, Ruby stepped back. Nash entered, setting the basket on the table, looking around the simple room with barely concealed superiority. "Silas keeps things sparse, doesn't he? Very different from what you're used to in Pittsburgh, I imagine." "It's comfortable," Ruby said stiffly. Of course, of course." Nash turned to face her, his expression shifting to practiced sympathy. "Ruby, I know we barely know each other, but we're family now, and family looks out for each other. I've been hearing things in town. Troubling things." "What things?" "People are concerned about you, about how you're being treated. This injury, the circumstances around it. Some folks are saying Silas was, well, inappropriate in how he handled the situation." Ruby felt anger flare hot in her chest. "Silas saved me from potentially losing the use of my leg. He acted exactly as he should have." Nash held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I believe you, I do. But you have to understand how it looks to others. Silas is rough, uneducated in the ways of polite society. He doesn't understand that a man needs to be more careful with a lady's modesty, her reputation. In Pittsburgh, would a gentleman tear a woman's dress in public, even with good intentions? We weren't in public. We were on our own land. But you were visible from the road. Joel Henricks saw everything, and now he's told others. The damage to your reputation is already done." Nash took a step closer. "Ruby, I can help you. I have influence in this town. I can guide the narrative. Make sure people understand this was just a misunderstanding. But you need to let me help you." "I don't need your help." Nash's expression hardened for just a fraction of a second before the sympathetic mask slipped back into place. "Don't you? You're isolated out here. You have no friends, no support system. The whole town is talking about you, about how desperate you must have been to marry a man like Silas. How sad it is that you've fallen into this situation." Each word was calculated to wound, to make her feel small and helpless and dependent. "Mr. Tucker," Ruby said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I know what you did to Martha Chen." The mask cracked. Nash's eyes went cold. "Mrs. Chen is a bitter woman who can't accept that her poor decisions led to her circumstances. Whatever she's told you is colored by her own failures. She told me you stole her land, that you spread lies about her when she wouldn't marry you, that you're doing the same thing to me now." Nash laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And you believe her? A Chinese widow with an axe to grind over a respectable businessman? Ruby, you're smarter than that, or at least I thought you were. I believe her because I've seen the way you look at me, like I'm a thing to be acquired, not a person. I believe her because every word you've said today has been designed to make me doubt myself, doubt Silas, doubt everything except you." Nash's friendly expression vanished entirely, replaced by something ugly. "You're making a mistake. Silas can't protect you. He's barely more than an animal, living out here in the dirt. You deserve better. You could have better, with me. Get out." "Ruby, think about what you're saying. Think about your future." "I said get out." For a moment, Nash just stared at her, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. Then he picked up his basket and walked to the door. He paused on the threshold, looking back. "You'll regret this. When the whole town turns on you, when you have nowhere to go and no one to turn to, you'll remember that I offered you a way out. And by then the offer will be gone." He left, mounting his horse and riding away without looking back. Ruby sank into a chair, her hands shaking. She'd stood up to him, refused to be intimidated. But Nash's threat echoed in her mind. When the whole town turns on you. What would she do then? When Silas returned an hour later, He found Ruby sitting in the dimming light, staring at nothing. He listened as she recounted Nash's visit, his face growing darker with each word. "I should have been here," he said when she finished. "I'm glad you weren't. If you'd been here, it would have been different. Angrier. This way I got to face him myself. I got to tell him no." Silas knelt beside her chair, looking up at her with those steady dark eyes. "I'm proud of you, but Nash is right about one thing. This is going to get harder before it gets better. Are you sure you want to fight this? I could arrange passage back to Pittsburgh. You could start over somewhere else." Ruby reached out and placed her hand over his rough, calloused one. "I spent my whole life running from people's judgments, trying to make myself smaller and quieter and less. I'm done running. If I leave now, Nash wins. He gets to prove Silas isn't good enough. He gets to prove I wasn't strong enough, and I won't give him that." Something shifted in Silas's expression. Respect, admiration, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. "Then we fight," he said simply. "Together." The next morning, Silas rode into town to see Sheriff Abner Holt. The sheriff's office was a small wooden building near the center of Coldwater, with bars on one window and a worn sign that had been repainted more times than anyone could count. Holt was 58 years old, with thinning gray hair and a weather-beaten face that had seen too much human cruelty to be shocked by much anymore. He'd been sheriff for 12 years, elected and re-elected because he was fair, thorough, and absolutely incorruptible. He was also one of the few men in Coldwater who'd never treated Silas like a second-class citizen. "Silas," Holt said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Heard you might be coming in. This about your wife's injury? You already heard about it? Whole town's heard about it. Question is, which version is true? Joel Henrichs' story or yours?" Silas laid it out simply and directly. The gunshot that spooked the horse, Ruby's fall, the need to check her injury immediately to assess whether the bone was broken, the brief, necessary exposure of her knee, the proper bandaging, nothing inappropriate, nothing improper. Just basic medical sense. Holt listened without interrupting, making notes on a piece of paper. When Silas finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair. "I believe you, Silas. I've known you 15 years. You're the most honorable man I've met. But believing you and being able to do something about this are two different things." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Joel Henrichs swears he saw what he saw. He's got 6 men who'll testify he told them the same story the very night it happened. Consistent details. No contradictions. And Nash Tucker, your own brother, has been expressing concern about the situation. Says he's worried about Mrs. Crow's well-being. Says he thinks you might not understand how to treat a refined lady." Silas felt anger build in his chest, hot and tight. Nash is lying. He's manipulating this whole situation. "Probably, but I can't arrest a man for lying unless it's under oath. And right now, this is he said. You need more than your word against Joel's. You need proof." "What kind of proof?" Holt thought for a moment. "Get Doc Brennan to examine your wife. Get him to write up a medical report documenting that her injury is consistent with a fall, that the treatment was appropriate. That'll help. Find out if anyone else saw or heard anything that contradicts Joel's story. And for God's sake, watch your back. If Nash is behind this, he's not going to stop with rumors." Silas stood, extending his hand. Holt shook it firmly. "One more thing," the sheriff said. "There's been talk about calling a community meeting at the church. Let people air their concerns, hear different sides of the story. Reverend Pike is considering it. If that happens, make sure your wife is ready. They're going to ask her questions. They're going to judge her. It won't be pleasant. She's stronger than people think. She'll need to be." Silas's next stop was Doc Ernest Brennan's office, a small building that smelled of carbolic acid and old books. Doc Brennan was 50 years old, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that were steady even after 30 years of frontier medicine. He listened to Silas's request without surprise. "Already heard about this situation. Figured you'd be by. Bring Mrs. Crow in tomorrow morning. I'll do a thorough examination, document everything properly. If anyone questions my findings, they can take it up with the Territorial Medical Board." "Thank you, Doc." Brennan waved off the gratitude. "I'm not doing this as a favor, Silas. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and because I've seen what happens when rumors go unchecked in small towns. People get hurt. Sometimes they get killed. I won't be party to that if I can help it." The examination the next morning was professional and thorough. Doc Brennan examined Ruby's knee, measured the bruising, checked the range of motion, asked detailed questions about the fall and the immediate aftermath. When he finished, he sat at his desk and wrote out a formal report in his careful, precise handwriting. The injury is entirely consistent with a fall from a horse, he said, signing and dating the document. The bruising pattern, the location, the severity, all match exactly what you'd expect. The treatment Mr. Crow provided was appropriate and likely prevented further injury. There is no evidence whatsoever of inappropriate conduct. He handed the report to Ruby. Keep this safe. You might need it. Over the next few days, Martha Chen moved quietly through Coldwater, talking to the few people she trusted. She spoke to the blacksmith, who owed Silas money from a loan that Silas had never pressed him to repay. She spoke to the seamstress, who remembered how Nash had cheated her out of payment for 3 suits 2 years ago. She spoke to the owner of the feed store, who'd seen Joel Henricks counting a large stack of silver coins the morning after the supposed incident. Seeds of doubt, small cracks in the story, not enough to change most minds, but enough to make a few people pause and reconsider. At the same time, Nash was working just as hard in the opposite direction. He made sure to be seen everywhere in town, always with an expression of deep concern, always ready to quietly share his worries about his brother's treatment of poor Ruby. He was particularly effective with the women of Coldwater, who found his refined manners and educated speech far more appealing than Silas's rough mountain ways. "I love my brother," Nash would say, shaking his head sadly. "But he raised me, not the other way around. He doesn't understand civilized society. And that poor woman, coming from Pittsburgh, educated and refined, she deserves so much better than what she's getting." The women nodded sympathetically. Poor Nash, burdened with such a crude brother. Poor Ruby, trapped in an unfortunate situation. By the end of the week, Coldwater had divided into camps. The majority believed Nash and Joel's version of events. A small minority, mostly people who'd been helped by Silas over the years, remained skeptical. And a handful, led by Sheriff Holt and Martha Chen, were quietly working to uncover the truth. Then Reverend Pike announced there would be a community meeting at the church on Sunday evening. All were invited to attend. The purpose was to address concerns about the Crow situation and determine whether any action needed to be taken to protect Mrs. Crow's well-being. When Ruby heard the news, she felt her stomach drop. A public trial. That's what this was. She'd be standing in front of the entire town, being judged, questioned, examined like a specimen under glass. "I don't know if I can do this," she told Silas that evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. Silas had brought out 2 chairs, positioned them close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "We can leave it tonight. Head west, start over somewhere else. Colorado maybe, or Wyoming. Somewhere no one knows us." Ruby was tempted. God, she was tempted. To run, to hide, to never face the judgment she knew was waiting. But then she thought about Martha Chen, who'd faced down this same cruelty and survived. She thought about all the years she'd spent making herself smaller, quieter, less, trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. She thought about the person she wanted to become. "No," she said finally. "I'm staying, I'm fighting. Even if I lose, at least I'll lose on my feet." Silas reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm and steady. "Then we'll face it together. And whatever happens, you won't be alone." They sat in silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue, stars beginning to emerge one by one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles. But tonight they had this moment of peace. And sometimes that was enough. Inside the house, Ruby's thoughts turned to the meeting ahead. She'd need to prepare, to think through what she'd say, how she'd respond to accusations and questions designed to trap her. But more than that, she'd need to decide who she was going to be when she stood in front of that crowd. The old Ruby, apologetic and small, desperate for acceptance. Or someone new, someone stronger, someone who refused to be defined by other people's judgments. The choice was hers to make. And for the first time in her life, Ruby Mae Watson Crow was ready to choose herself. Miles away, in his room above the saloon, Nash Tucker was also preparing for Sunday's meeting. But his preparations were different. He was rehearsing his speech, perfecting his expression of brotherly concern, planning exactly how to position himself as the reasonable voice of civilization. He had Joel prepared to give testimony. He had sympathetic townspeople ready to express their concerns. He had everything arranged to ensure that when the meeting ended, public opinion would be firmly against Silas. And then, in the aftermath, when Ruby was isolated and desperate, he'd make his final move. It was all going according to plan. Or so he thought. What Nash didn't know was that Martha Chen had spent the last 3 days tracking down every business transaction he'd made in the past 6 years. What he didn't know was that Sheriff Holt had quietly interviewed Joel Henrichs' drinking buddies and discovered the hired hand had been bragging about a big payday from Mr. Tucker. What he didn't know was that Doc Brennan had written to a colleague in Pittsburgh who'd confirmed that Ruby Watson's family had indeed fallen on hard times, but that Ruby herself was known as honest, intelligent, and kind. Nothing like the desperate, unstable woman Nash had been subtly describing. The trap Nash thought he'd set was about to close on him instead. But first there would be the meeting, the confrontation, the moment when everything would be decided. Sunday evening approached like a storm on the horizon, inevitable, dangerous, possible to avoid. Ruby spent Saturday evening with Martha, rehearsing what she'd say, practicing how to stay calm under pressure. Martha coached her with the patience of someone who'd survived her own public trial. "They'll try to make you angry," Martha said. "Don't let them. Anger makes you look unstable. They'll try to make you cry. Don't let them. Tears make you look weak. You need to be steady, calm, and absolutely truthful. Even when the truth is hard. What if they don't believe me? Some won't, no matter what you say, but you're not talking to them. You're talking to the people in the middle, the ones who haven't made up their minds yet. Those are the ones you need to reach." Saturday night, Ruby couldn't sleep. She lay in her small room, listening to the house settle, thinking about tomorrow, about standing in front of all those people, about the judgment in their eyes, about the choice she was making to fight instead of flee. Downstairs, Silas couldn't sleep either. He sat in his chair by the cold fireplace, his mother's banjo in his hands, playing softly so as not to disturb Ruby. The old mountain songs his mother had taught him, melodies of hardship and survival and endurance. He'd faced down blizzards and droughts and financial ruin. He'd buried his parents and raised his brother and built a life from nothing. But he'd never been afraid of losing something the way he was afraid of losing Ruby. Not because he owned her, she could never be owned, but because somewhere in the past 2 weeks, she'd become important to him in a way he hadn't expected. She'd become home, and he'd fight heaven and hell to protect that. Sunday dawned clear and bright, mocking the tension that gripped both the Crow Ranch and the town of Coldwater. Ruby dressed carefully in her best dress, the dark blue one she'd worn on the train. She pinned her hair up neatly. She looked at herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Scared, yes, but not broken. Not anymore. Silas hitched up the wagon and they rode into town in silence. Martha met them at the church entrance, along with Sheriff Holt and Doc Brennan, a small group of allies in a sea of judgment. "Ready?" Martha asked quietly. Ruby took a deep breath, "As I'll ever be." They walked into the church together and every head turned to watch. The battle was about to begin. The church was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls, bodies pressed together in the summer heat. The air was thick with sweat and whispered conversations that died the moment Ruby Mae Watson Crowe walked through the door. She felt every eye on her as she moved down the center aisle, Silas on one side, Martha Chen on the other. Sheriff Holt and Doc Brennan followed close behind, a small fortress of support in a room full of judgment. Ruby kept her head up, her shoulders back, even as her knee throbbed with each step. She would not limp. She would not show weakness. Not here. Not now. Reverend Samuel Pike stood at the front, hands clasped nervously, his soft face shining with perspiration. He'd never been comfortable with conflict, preferred his sermons to focus on gentle topics like forgiveness and grace. But he couldn't avoid this. The whole town had demanded it. "Please," Pike said, his voice barely audible over the murmuring crowd. "Please, everyone take a seat. Let's conduct this meeting with dignity and Christian charity." The murmuring didn't stop, but people settled into their places. Ruby took a seat in the front pew, Silas beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Martha sat on Ruby's other side, her spine straight, her expression calm. She'd been through this before. She knew what was coming. Nash Tucker sat 3 rows back, perfectly positioned to appear concerned but not confrontational. He wore his best suit, his hair carefully styled, his expression arranged into brotherly worry. Joel Henricks sat beside him, hat in hand, looking like a reluctant witness forced to tell an uncomfortable truth. The performance was masterful. "We're gathered here this evening," Pike began, clearing his throat, "to address concerns that have been raised about the well-being of Mrs. Ruby Crow. Some members of our community have witnessed or heard of incidents that trouble them. We thought it best to bring everything into the open, to hear from all parties, and to determine if any action needs to be taken." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Henricks, would you please share what you witnessed?" Joel stood slowly, playing the part of the reluctant truth-teller. He twisted his hat in his hands, looked down at his feet, then finally met the crowd's eyes. "I don't like saying this," Joel began, his voice carrying just the right note of discomfort. "Silas Crow has been nothing but fair to me as an employer. But what I saw last week, I can't stay silent about it." He described the scene, Ruby riding the horse, the fall, and then, in language carefully chosen to sound damning without being explicitly false, he described Silas tearing Ruby's dress, exposing her leg, while she said don't, and tried to pull away. "I know what I saw," Joel concluded, "and it didn't look right. A man should have more respect for a lady's modesty, especially in public view where anyone could see." The crowd murmured, heads nodding. This confirmed what they had already heard, what they wanted to believe. The rough mountain man who didn't know how to treat a refined city woman. Pike looked pained. "Mrs. Crow, would you like to respond?" Ruby stood slowly, feeling hundreds of eyes on her. Her heart hammered so hard she thought everyone must hear it. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I'd like to tell you what actually happened that day." She described the gunshot that spooked Juniper. The fall, the immediate sharp pain in her knee, the blood soaking through her dress. "I was frightened," Ruby said clearly. "I thought my leg might be broken. When my husband knelt beside me and said he needed to check the injury, I said don't, because I was scared someone might see, not because he was doing anything wrong, because I was worried about appearances." She paused, letting that sink in. "My husband told me he wouldn't gamble with my health because of what strangers might think. He examined my knee, determined it wasn't broken, bandaged it properly, and carried me home. He acted exactly as any reasonable person would in a medical emergency." "That's not what it looked like from where I stood," Joel interjected. Ruby turned to face him directly. "How much did Nash Tucker pay you to stand where you were standing, Mr. Henricks?" The church erupted, voices raised in shock, in anger, in excitement at this unexpected turn. Pike banged his hand on the pulpit, calling for order. Joel's face flushed red. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sheriff Holt stood, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I do. I've got 3 witnesses who'll testify they saw you counting out 50 silver dollars the morning after this incident. $50 you couldn't explain, except to say you'd done a job for Mr. Tucker." All eyes swung to Nash, who remained perfectly composed. He stood, his expression one of hurt confusion. "Sheriff, I did pay Joel for work. He helped me survey some land I'm considering purchasing. That's hardly a crime. If you're suggesting I paid him to lie, you're gravely mistaken." "Then let's talk about Martha Chen," Ruby said, her voice growing stronger. "Let's talk about how 6 years ago you courted her, promised to help her after her husband died, then stole her land and destroyed her reputation when she wouldn't marry you." Martha stood beside Ruby, adding her voice. "I have documentation. Transfer papers Nash had me sign under false pretenses. Testimony from people who heard him spread lies about me. The same pattern he's using now against Ruby and Silas." Nash's calm facade cracked slightly. "Mrs. Chen is a bitter woman who made poor business decisions and has blamed me for her failures ever since. This is slander." "Is it?" Doc Brennan stood, holding up his medical report. "Because I examined Mrs. Crow 2 days ago. Her injury is entirely consistent with a fall from a horse. The treatment Mr. Crow provided was appropriate and likely prevented serious complications. There's no evidence of any improper conduct." He handed the document to Reverend Pike, who read it with growing discomfort. The crowd was beginning to shift, confusion replacing certainty, doubt creeping in where there had been judgment. Mrs. Harriet Pritchard stood, her thin face set in stubborn lines. "Even so, Mrs. Crow came here under questionable circumstances. A mail-order bride, desperate enough to marry a man she'd never met. How do we know she's telling the truth now? Perhaps she's simply too ashamed to admit what really happened. Ruby felt the old shame try to rise up, but she pushed it down. She'd come too far to let that voice win now. "You're right, Mrs. Pritchard," Ruby said, her voice ringing clear through the church. "I did come here desperate, but I'm not desperate anymore." She paused, letting the simple truth settle over the crowd. "I came west expecting nothing but a roof over my head and work to do. What I found was a man who treated me with more respect and kindness than anyone in my so-called civilized family ever had." Ruby's voice grew stronger. "You want to judge me for being desperate? Fine, judge me. But understand this. I may have come here with nothing, but I'm not nothing. I'm not a victim who needs rescuing by Nash Tucker or anyone else. I'm a woman who made a choice, who's willing to work hard, who won't be defined by other people's prejudices." The silence that followed was profound. Ruby stood there, trembling but unbowed, having spoken a truth that resonated beyond just her own situation. Then slowly, a man in the back row stood. It was the blacksmith, a burly man named Tom Crawford, who owed Silas money from 3 years ago. "I got something to say," Crawford announced. "Silas Crow loaned me $200 when my forge burned down. Didn't ask for collateral, didn't charge interest, didn't press me when I couldn't pay on time. He just said, 'Pay me when you can, Tom. We all need help sometimes.' That's the man you're accusing of being cruel and dishonorable." A woman stood next, the seamstress, Alice Morrison. "Nash Tucker ordered 3 suits from me 2 years ago, never paid. When I asked for my money, he told people I did shoddy work and couldn't be trusted. I nearly lost my business. That's the man you're trusting to tell you the truth about his brother." One by one, people stood. The feed store owner, who'd extended credit to Silas during a hard winter and been repaid with interest plus a generous tip. The widow Thompson, whose roof Silas had repaired without being asked and refused payment for. The school teacher, who remembered Nash cheating at cards and lying about it when caught. Not everyone. The majority still sat silent, unwilling to publicly change their position. But enough stood to create a tide, a shift in the atmosphere of the room. Nash's composure was cracking. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched. He stood again, his voice sharp with barely controlled anger. "This is ridiculous. You're all being manipulated by a woman who's clearly unstable and a brother who's always resented my success. I came here out of genuine concern for Ruby's well-being, and this is what I get? Accusations and slander?" "Then explain the $50 to Joel," Sheriff Holt said calmly. "Explain the pattern with Mrs. Chen. Explain why a land survey would require payment in cash immediately after an incident involving your brother." "I don't have to explain anything to you," Nash snapped. "I'm not on trial here." "Maybe you should be," Martha said quietly. Nash turned on her, his mask finally falling away completely. "You should be grateful I even looked at you. A Chinese widow, nothing to offer but a dying business and a name no one could pronounce. I gave you opportunities you didn't deserve, and you threw them back in my face." The racism in his voice, the unveiled contempt, shocked even some of his supporters. This wasn't the smooth, educated gentleman they thought they knew. "There it is," Martha said, her voice steady despite the hurt in her eyes. "That's the real Nash Tucker. Not the concerned brother, not the civilized businessman, just a small, bitter man who can't stand being second to anyone." Nash looked around the church, seeing the shift in expressions, the doubt in eyes that had been certain moments before. He was losing control of the narrative, losing the respect he had so carefully cultivated. He played his last card. "Fine," he said, his voice cold. "You want the truth? I'll give you the truth. Silas has been incompetent in managing our shared land holdings. I have documentation of his poor decisions, his refusal to modernize, his stubborn insistence on outdated methods. As his business partner and brother, I have the legal right to petition for control of the property if he's proven incapable." He pulled papers from his jacket pocket, holding them up. "I didn't want it to come to this. I hoped to handle it quietly, within the family. But if you're going to force my hand, then yes, I'm petitioning for control of the Crow Ranch on grounds of Silas's incompetence and his recent behavior that calls his judgment into question." Silas stood slowly, his weathered face showing the first real anger Ruby had seen from him. His voice when he spoke was quiet but carried the weight of mountains. Those papers are forgeries. I never signed any partnership agreement with you, Nash. The land is mine, bought with money I earned, registered in my name alone. You've been telling people we're partners for years, but it's a lie. Prove it, Nash challenged. Sheriff Holt pulled it out of a folder. I already did. Check the land registry office. The Crow Ranch is registered solely to Silas Tobias Crow. Has been for 15 years. Nash Tucker's name appears nowhere on the deed. Nash's face went pale, then flushed deep red. He'd been caught in a fundamental lie, one that undermined everything else he'd claimed. Reverend Pike found his voice, shaky but determined. Mr. Tucker, I think you should leave. This meeting was supposed to be about ensuring Mrs. Crow's welfare, not about your business dealings with your brother. This isn't over, Nash said, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at Ruby with pure hatred. You could have had everything. Respect, comfort, a real place in this community. Instead, you chose him. You'll regret it. I already have everything I need, Ruby said quietly. And I've never regretted choosing honesty over convenience. Nash stormed out, Joel Henrik scrambling to follow. The church erupted into conversation, everyone talking at once. Pike banged on the pulpit again. Please, please, order. I think we need to address the original question. Mrs. Crow, do you feel safe in your current situation? Do you feel you have been treated with respect and dignity by your husband? Ruby looked at Silas, at this rough, bearded man who'd never once made her feel like a burden, who'd defended her, believed in her, stood beside her when it would have been easier to send her away. I feel safer and more respected than I ever did in my family's house in Pittsburgh, Ruby said clearly. Silas Crow is the most honorable man I've ever known, and I'm proud to be his wife. Silas reached out and took her hand, right there in front of everyone. A simple gesture, but it said everything that needed saying. Pike nodded slowly. Then I believe this matter is settled, unless anyone else has legitimate concerns to raise. Mrs. Pritchard stood, her thin face working through some internal struggle. Finally, she spoke, her voice tight. I may have been hasty in my judgment. Mrs. Crow, I apologize for my treatment of you at the store. You're welcome there anytime. It wasn't warm, it wasn't effusive, but it was something. A crack in the wall of judgment. Others followed, some with genuine apologies, others with grudging acknowledgments that maybe they'd been too quick to believe the worst. Not everyone. Some left the church still convinced Nash had been wronged. But the tide had turned enough. As people filed out, talking in groups, processing what they'd witnessed, Ruby felt the tension drain from her body. She sagged against Silas, who wrapped an arm around her shoulders. You did good, he murmured. Real good. Martha approached, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you for speaking up about what Nash did to me, for making them hear it. Thank you for being brave enough to tell your story first, Ruby replied. I couldn't have done this without you. Sheriff Holt joined them, his expression grim. This isn't completely over. Nash is going to be angry, humiliated. Men like that, they don't just accept defeat. You need to be careful. What can he do? Ruby asked. I don't know, but I'll be watching him closely, and if he steps 1 foot out of line, I'll be ready. Doc Brennan added, I'll make sure copies of my medical report are filed with the territorial authorities, just in case anyone tries to revive these accusations later. They were building a fortress of documentation and witnesses, creating a record that couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten. As they left the church, stepping out into the warm evening air, Ruby saw the town with new eyes. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly welcoming. But it was hers now, in a way it hadn't been before. She'd fought for her place here. She'd earned it. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and orange and deep purple. When they reached the house, Silas helped Ruby down from the wagon, his hands gentle on her waist. For a moment they stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the scent of leather and prairie grass that clung to his clothes. Ruby, he said quietly, I need to tell you something. Her heart jumped. What? When I sent for a mail-order bride, I was looking for partnership, companionship, someone to help build this place into something that would last. I wasn't looking for love. Didn't think I had any left to give after all these years. He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. But somewhere between you fixing that chicken and standing up in that church tonight, Something changed. I can't offer you poetry or fancy words, but I can offer you honesty. And the honest truth is, I'm falling in love with you. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the tears she'd shed so many times before. These were tears of joy, of relief, of coming home. I came here expecting nothing, she whispered. But I found everything. I found someone who sees me, really sees me, and doesn't look away. I love you too, Silas. Not because I'm desperate or grateful, but because you're good and kind and real. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, asking permission with every movement. And she kissed him back, pouring into it all the words she didn't have, all the feelings that were too big for language. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Silas smiled, a real smile full and bright beneath his beard. We should probably go inside before the neighbors start talking. Ruby laughed, the sound surprised out of her. I think they've done enough talking for one day. But they went inside anyway, into the house that was becoming a home, into a life they were building together one day at a time. 6 months passed, winter came to Kansas, covering the prairie in snow, making the Smoky Hills live up to their name. The ranch settled into the rhythms of cold weather work, feeding cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, keeping the house warm against the bitter wind. Ruby's belly swelled with pregnancy, a development that surprised and delighted them both. Silas treated her like precious glass until she finally told him firmly that she was pregnant, not broken, and still perfectly capable of gathering eggs and cooking meals. In town, the scandal slowly faded, replaced by new gossip, new dramas. Some people never changed their minds about the Crows, would always believe Nash's version of events. But enough had shifted that Ruby could shop at Pritchard's store without being refused service, could attend church without feeling every eye judging her. Martha Chen became a regular visitor at the ranch, a friend and mentor who taught Ruby about surviving in a world that didn't always want to make space for you. Nash had left Coldwater 2 weeks after the church meeting, unable to face the whispers and the knowing looks. He'd gone east, supposedly to pursue new business opportunities. Joel Henricks had slunk away shortly after, finding work on a ranch 2 counties over. Good riddance to both of them. On a cold January morning, Silas rode into town to visit the sheriff. Holt had sent word that there was news. Got a letter from Philadelphia, Holt said, handing over an envelope. Thought you should see it. The letter was from a bank, forwarded through legal channels. It informed Silas that Lydia Ashford Montgomery, wife of banker Charles Montgomery, had written to their institution inquiring about Nash Coleman Tucker. The bank's response, included in the forwarding, was brief and devastating. Mr. Tucker had no accounts with their institution, held no properties, had no business relationships of any kind. In fact, their records showed he'd been refused a basic savings account 3 years ago due to insufficient funds and questionable references. All of Nash's talk of success, of business opportunities, of rising in the world, had been lies. He'd been living on credit and borrowed money, maintaining an illusion of prosperity while slowly drowning in debt. Lydia Montgomery's inquiry had been prompted by Nash's own letters to her, begging for a chance to prove himself, promising her he was now worthy of her consideration. She'd investigated and found nothing but smoke and mirrors. The final humiliation, she'd written back to Nash directly, a copy of which the bank had thoughtfully included. Mr. Tucker, I barely remember you. You were a clerk in my father's office 15 years ago. I have no interest in renewing any acquaintance. Please do not contact me again. Silas read the letters twice, then folded them carefully. He destroyed himself chasing a ghost. Some men do, Holt agreed. Question is, will he stay gone? I think so. There's nothing left for him here except shame. And if there's one thing Nash can't tolerate, it's being seen as less than he pretends to be. Silas rode home slowly, thinking about his brother, about the bright, clever boy Nash had been, full of potential and promise, about the bitter, destructive man he'd become, eaten alive by resentment and the need to prove himself better than everyone else. It was sad, but it was also a choice Nash had made over and over until there was no turning back. When Silas reached the ranch, he found Ruby in the kitchen, one hand on her swollen belly, the other stirring a pot of stew. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that made his chest ache with love. How was town? Informative, Silas said, hanging up his coat. Nash is gone for good, won't be coming back. Good, Ruby said simply. Then, do you think he'll ever find what he's looking for? Silas thought about the letters, about Lydia Montgomery, who barely remembered Nash existed, about all the years Nash had wasted trying to prove something to people who didn't care. No, he said honestly, because what he was looking for doesn't exist. He wanted to be someone important, someone respected, someone who mattered. But he never understood that those things come from who you are, not from what you have or who acknowledges you. Ruby nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd fought her own battle with that need for external validation, had learned the hard way that the only approval that truly mattered was your own. Come here, she said, reaching for him. Feel this. She placed his hand on her belly, and he felt it, the flutter of movement, their child turning in the womb. Life continuing, growing, becoming. It's strong, Silas said, wonder in his voice. She's strong, Ruby corrected with a smile. I think it's a girl, and I want to name her Grace. Grace, boss, because that's what brought us together, not desperation or convenience or circumstance. Grace. Unearned, unexpected, transformative grace. Silas pulled her close as her belly would allow, and kissed the top of her head. Grace Crow, I like it. They stood there in the warm kitchen, the stew bubbling on the stove, snow falling softly outside, creating a world that was just the two of them and the life they were building. It wasn't perfect. Life never was. There would be hard times ahead, difficult seasons, challenges they couldn't foresee. But they'd face them together. These two people who'd come together as strangers and built something real, something that lasted. The next spring, as the prairie bloomed with wildflowers and the Smoky Hills turned green, Ruby gave birth to a daughter. Grace Ellen Crow came into the world on a warm April morning, weighing 8 pounds and announcing her arrival with lungs that suggested she'd inherited her mother's strength of will. Silas delivered the baby himself, the doctor not making it in time from town, his hands steady and sure as he caught his daughter and placed her on Ruby's chest. He wept openly, unashamed, as he watched his wife cradle their child. Martha Chen arrived that afternoon, bringing food and supplies and the kind of practical help that only someone who truly understood could provide. She held Grace while Ruby slept, rocking the baby and singing soft songs in Chinese, her own losses and griefs woven into blessing for this new life. Over the coming weeks, visitors came from town, some out of genuine kindness, others out of curiosity. Mrs. Pritchard brought a carefully knitted baby blanket. Doc Brennan examined both mother and child and pronounced them perfectly healthy. Sheriff Holt stopped by with a handmade wooden rattle, looking uncomfortable with sentiment, but clearly pleased. Even Reverend Pike came, offering a blessing and a tentative olive branch, his own conscience apparently troubled by how close he'd come to siding with Nash's cruelty. The community that had nearly destroyed them was slowly, imperfectly, becoming something better. Not because everyone had changed their hearts, but because Ruby and Silas had refused to be defined by others' judgments. They'd stood their ground, told their truth, and forced people to confront their own prejudices. Some had listened, some had learned, and that was enough. On Grace's first birthday, they held a small celebration at the ranch. Martha came, of course, Sheriff Holt and his wife, Doc Brennan, a handful of neighbors who'd become genuine friends rather than just acquaintances. As the adults talked and the spring sun shone warm on the prairie grass, Ruby stood on the porch holding her daughter, watching Silas teach Grace how to pet a chicken gently. Martha joined her, two women who'd survived their own trials and emerged stronger. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd left when Nash first started his campaign? Martha asked quietly. Ruby considered the question. Sometimes. I think about how easy it would have been to run, to decide I wasn't strong enough, wasn't worth the fight, but then I look at this. She gestured to the scene before them, the home they'd built, the life they'd created. And I'm so glad I stayed. So is the town, whether they know it or not, Martha said. You showed them something important. That cruelty doesn't win just because it's loud. That truth matters. That standing up for yourself isn't the same as being difficult. Ruby smiled. You showed me that first. When you told me your story, when you stood beside me in that church, you gave me the courage to fight. We gave each other courage, Martha corrected. That's what women do when the world tries to tear us down. We stand together. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration wound down, Ruby found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From Pittsburgh to Kansas, from desperation to belonging, from someone defined by others' cruelty to someone who defined herself. It hadn't been easy. There had been pain, fear, moments when giving up seemed like the only option. But she'd persevered. With Silas beside her, with Martha's friendship, with her own stubborn refusal to be broken. And now she had this, a home, a family, a place in the world that she'd earned not through compliance or diminishing herself, but through standing firm in who she was. That evening, after everyone had left and Grace was asleep in her cradle, Ruby and Silas sat on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie. The same view they'd watched that first week, when everything was uncertain and fragile. "Do you ever regret it?" Ruby asked. "Advertising for a wife, taking a chance on a stranger?" Silas took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Every day I wake up grateful that you answered that advertisement, that you were brave enough to come west, that you chose to stay when leaving would have been easier." "I chose you," Ruby said simply, "and I'd make that choice again every single day." As darkness fell and stars emerged one by one in the vast Kansas sky, they sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who'd found each other across distance and circumstance, who'd built something real from nothing, who'd faced down cruelty and emerged victorious. Not because they were perfect, but because they were honest, because they chose each other, day after day, in small acts and large gestures, because they understood that love wasn't about grand gestures or poetic words. It was about showing up, about standing beside someone when the world turned against them, about building a life together, one day at a time, one choice at a time. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The story of Ruby Mae Watson and Silas Tobias Crow became the kind of tale people told in Coldwater for years afterward. Not the scandal Nash had tried to create, but the truth of what actually happened. They talked about the city woman who came west with nothing and built a life through strength and determination. About the mountain man who proved that honor wasn't about polish or education, but about character. About the town that almost made a terrible mistake and learned something important in the process. And when people asked Ruby years later what advice she'd give to someone facing impossible odds, she always said the same thing. Stand your ground. Tell your truth. Don't let anyone else define who you are or what you're worth. It won't be easy. People will judge you, condemn you, try to make you small. But if you stay true to yourself, if you find the people who see your worth and hold on to them, you'll survive. More than survive. You'll thrive. Because that's what she'd done. That's what this story, this life had taught her. And it was a lesson worth sharing. The end came not with drama, but with peace. Years of quiet happiness, of work and love and family. Silas and Ruby grew old together on their prairie ranch, watching their daughter grow, welcoming grandchildren, building a legacy that had nothing to do with wealth or status and everything to do with integrity. When people remembered them, they didn't talk about the scandal or the confrontation or the battle against prejudice. They talked about the love, about two people who found each other across impossible distances and built something that lasted. That was the real story. That was what mattered. And on warm summer evenings, when the wind blew across the Kansas prairie and the Smoky Hills stood purple against the sunset, you could almost hear it. The ghost of a banjo playing mountain songs, a woman's laughter, a child's voice calling across the yard. The echo of a life well lived, the echo of a love that endured, the echo of truth victorious. And that, in the end, was the only story worth telling.